For the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about the women who founded or co founded some of the African continent's most well known clans. We met Munu of the Lubara from Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan, Kibumba Bumba of the Luba from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mumbi from the Gikuyu of Kenya. We've also talked about Anoa, the mythical ancestress of the Akan of Ghana, Abrahapoku of the Baole of Cote d'Ivoire, Yenenga of the Mosi from Burkina Faso, and from Cameroon we met Nandong of the Kom, Gonso of the Nso, Nyanya of the Ntum, who are the predecessors of the Oku people, and Nanyonga of the Balinyonga, who are all from the northwest region of Cameroon. Finally, we mentioned Tinhinan, the legendary queen and founder of the Tuareg people, whose history I explore in depth in my upcoming book, The Watkins Book of African Folklore, and it comes out in March of 2025. Now, some of you may not know this, but I generally don't plan MA podcast episodes in advance. Usually, I give myself the week to think about what I want to talk about, taking cues from previous episodes or anything that inspires me in the moment. And so, in this week's episode, we're inspired by two themes that emerged from last week's episode, and we will go on a detour to explore an interesting narrative which shows up in some stories about women, queens, founders in African mythology and folklore. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. If you remember from the story of Mumbi of the Kikuyu, which we heard last week, we found out that Kikuyu community started out women-oriented, and then the women were usurped by men, and men took power. The story of the Somali queen Arraweelo is another instance of this situation, and in this episode, we'll read two accounts of her life. One as recorded by British author and researcher Ralph E. Drake Brockman, in British Somaliland, which was published in 1912, and the other as told by Ladan Afi, who is a Somali political activist and poetess, and Farah Mohammed, who is a Somali writer. In Drake Brockman's account, the legend says that thousands of years ago, there lived in what was now the Somaliland a queen named Arraweelo, and she was greatly feared for her eccentricities. It is said that right at this time, save for a large mound of stones under which she is said to lie buried, there is no other trace of her ancient kingdom. But in Drake Brockman's account, towards the end of her life, she began to show favor towards women and great animosity towards men. And she had a daughter who, unfortunately for that situation, gave birth to a boy child. And as soon as Arraweelo heard, she gave orders that the child was to be emasculated. So Arraweelo's daughter strongly objected and begged her mother to spare the child, at least until he was weaned. So Arraweelo said, okay, that's fine. When the child is weaned, then we will go ahead and castrate the child. But when the child was weaned, the mother begged again and said, well, just let the child walk, let him take his first steps, and then we can go ahead and castrate him. And the mother said, okay, fine, we can do that. And then as soon as the child learned to use his legs, Arraweelo called again for the child to be castrated. And her daughter begged again and said, please let him learn to be a boy, to herd sheep and goats and enjoy his childhood. And then we can castrate him. And Arraweelo said, okay, fine, we can do that. So time wore on and the boy grew older. And each time Arraweelo asked her daughter to bring the boy to be castrated, he the mother would find some reason to stop that from happening. And so it went on and on and on until the child became, a young man. And so the situation became untenable because Arawibo was apparently determined to castrate her grandson. But eventually, the young man himself learned all that was happening, what his grandmother wanted to do. And so he met with other men who he found out had also been castrated. So they got together and decided to kill Arawibo. And so one morning, the young man went to Arawibo and asked her if he should take the camels to water. And she said no, because she had not washed her little finger. The following day, he went again with the same request, and she refused because she had not washed her ring finger. He went again each day, and the response was the same because she had not washed her middle finger, she had not washed her forefinger, she had not washed her thumb. And in the commentary, the legend doesn't give any reason for these particular, commentary on fingers, but I bet there is some deeper meaning there, which if you poked into Somali culture and folklore and traditions, it makes sense. But eventually, on the eighth day, she consented and accompanied her grandson to the well. And in the story, her son is not named, at least in this version of the story, her grandson is not named. And the young man had previously arranged with his friends that they would kill her at the well. So, they would have the group would be present to do it, and there would be witnesses. And he also told them that if Arawilu, when he pierced her with his spear, said the words Tola Ayai, he would possibly require their help because she would possibly be a man, as the story goes. But if she said by Ayai, which is what the women said when they were hurt, then they would, they didn't need to interfere. So it seems like there was really some confusion about if this woman was really a man or a woman. And it goes back to that thing that was said about her eccentricities. So they went to the well, and he pierced her with his spear, and she cried out the way a woman would cry out. And so he killed her without really needing help from his friends. And there was great rejoicing among the men and lamentation among the women. And she was buried with great ceremony by the women who she favored. And meanwhile, the men of her kingdom came from far and near with stones to throw in contempt at her grave. And so it is said till this day, every Somali, as has been the custom for centuries, whenever their caravans pass the last resting place of Arawilu, will throw stones on the pile, while the women, so the Somali men do that, while the women, to show their respect for her memory, tear off small portions of their skirt and place it amongst the stones, or they break a small twig of the nearest green bush and place it there. So that's the story as told by British explorer Drake Brockman. Obviously, there's an orientation that story has, which is worth noting, because it contrasts with the account from Ladan Afi, who is a professor of political science and a poet, and is herself Somali. And in her account, Arawilu is not the devourer mother or castrating queen of Drake Brockman's account, but a liberatory figure who fought against the oppression of women. And in her story, once upon a time, Queen Arawilu ruled most of what is now Somalia. And when she was younger, Arawilu witnessed so many wars and conflicts between Somali, most of them led by men, and led to the senseless killing of young men and women and the destruction of villages. And she had also seen how the Council of Elders had made decisions which led to war. So she felt that these were due to the fact that some of the men on the council were not really smart or capable of being in a position of leadership. So in her mind, the recommendation was that the men would be replaced by women who were intelligent, could make competent decisions, were probably more inclined to be peaceful because they cared about their communities, and that this would be good for the community. But Arawilu was married, and her husband firmly disagreed with her. He said her place was to be in the home, taking care of the housework and the children, leave the politics to men. And so Arawilu, in a series of actions which are very, very well known to most Somali people, decided to organize a strike. So women went on a strike from doing household chores and taking care of the children. So the men had to do it, the cooking and the cleaning and the carrying of water and the fetching of firewood and looking after the children. The men got so preoccupied doing all these things. Arraweelo took over leadership, declared herself queen, and from there on, there was peace and prosperity in the land. Until she was murdered, of course. And Ladan Afi's account is elaborated upon in a gorgeously illustrated book by Somali writer Farah Mohammed. And the book is titled The Somali Queen, Queen Arraweelo, and there'll be a link to it in the episode notes. And he provides more details about Arraweelo's background and how she rose to power. She was a disenfranchised young woman who started out a widow, and in that culture at that time, unless the widow had children and property that the family had interest in protecting, she really received no support. And so she wanders off into the forest and with a couple of women built a community of their own, and they were so fierce and take care of themselves and building a strong community. Other people eventually joined them, and they became this force that would take on these warring tribes and tell them to get their act together. And so she built a really strong confederation of people who wanted to live in peace. They don't want to be at war all the time. Until, of course, she was murdered. And what I love about this version is that she was uncompromising in her quest for peace amongst her people. She was ready to do whatever it takes. Similar to Arraweelo is Fura, a queen from the 14th or 15th century in the Sidama region of southern Ethiopia, who also, as the legend goes, championed women and oppressed men. And according to the lore, she had all the smoke for men who were bald and old and short. Who knows what was going on there. But her reign also ended when she was tricked into riding a wild horse, which tore her apart and scattered her body across the country. And like Arraweelo, there's a place in Sidama country where they're named after her body parts. And I have to say, the narrative similarities and geographical proximity of these stories have me interested, but maybe that's an investigation for another time. In the Ibibio account of how men took power away from women, and Ibibio people are found in Nigeria, the women had an organization through which they took care of the community and worked together, and it was a very secret organization. And then one time, the men, after finding out some of the paraphernalia used by the organization, came to the older women and said, hey, let's work together. You guys should tell us what this is all about, because we should work together and be stronger together and have a stronger community. And the older women were like, we don't think this is the best idea. We know you guys, and you guys always have tricks up your sleeve. The younger women, who were a little more naive and forward thinking, like, we should work with the men and build a bigger, stronger society. So they gave the secrets away. And then, just as the older women suspected, the men cut them out, forbade them from ever participating in the rites, and that was under the punishment of death. And this story is found in British ethnologist Amory Talbot's very unfortunately titled book, Women's Mysteries Over Primitive People, the Ipipios of Southern Nigeria. I just cringe each time I read this title because, ugh. But then, if you're familiar at all with anthropological and ethnological folkloric texts from that era, you'll run into titles like this all the time, and which to me makes a case, for revision, re-examination, but that's a story for another time. So this theme in which women start out in power and then are tricked into surrendering or are overpowered by men can be found not just in historical African societies, but in many indigenous societies around the world. I believe it's found among I want to make sure I say this right, indigenous inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, which is at the tip of Southern America. That's one definite example of that. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a pretty common theme amongst a lot of Africa's forest people. And I bet, you look at history around the world, you will find this tension between men and women propping up here and there. And it's a classic manifestation of what we talked about last time, which was described by Ife Amadieme, the Nigerian anthropologist, this oppositional and contesting system of governance in which the balance of power will tilt and change, with men having it sometimes, women having it sometimes, sharing roles and status. So it's not an exception or an outlier. And in some cases, as among many of Central Africa's forest peoples, as well as forest peoples across the world, the crisis will resolve itself with an egalitarian system in which men and women share power, and there are elaborate mechanisms built in to check any excesses. So the men go to hunt, for example, but it is the women who distribute the meat and who make sure that different parts of meat go to the people who need it the most. And, there are processes and steps that need to happen. And there are times when women have their time together and it's protected, and their men have their time together and it's protected. And they have these elaborate checks and balances. If I remember, among forest people, the oldest women in the group have the rights to take anybody down a notch if they needed to, especially the men. But the way I see it, these stories really are a reminder that things don't have to be static, right? As we saw among the Gikuyu and among the Ibibio and in Somalia, sometimes the men successfully wrest power away from women and they change the structure of society forever. And in some cases, like the Somali story, it was first men and then the women took power and then the men took power back. So things don't have to be static. People always have the agency to change their circumstances for better or worse. And Araweelo's story is especially inspiring to me because despite the kind of obvious smear campaign against her, which, if we're being honest, could very well be based in truth, things were different back then and people used different means to ensure compliance. So it could very well be true that she had these extreme measures against men, but she, despite it all and despite the smear campaign, her legend endures as a symbol of women's empowerment in Somalia. And she still stands as a woman who did the necessary to better the lot of her people, the women in particular. And I think that's something to admire. So we'll stop here for now. Thank you for listening as always, and I will see you next week.